Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's structured conversation. We'll be starting momentarily. We're looking forward to having a great conversation. Okay, we're going to get started here. My name is Steve Sapinski. I am the Senior Assessment and Technology Specialist here at the University of Vermont. I will be joined by my co-facilitator, Elizabeth Dushik from the University of Utah. We wanted to run you through some of the basics of today's session. So on behalf of the SOL Professional Development Committee, we want to thank you so much for participating in today's session. Just a few logistics before we get started. You must have a YouTube account and channel to participate in the chat dialog box on the right side of your screen. If you do not have a channel, there is a link to create one. I encourage all of you to participate in today's discussion by asking questions, sharing comments, and providing feedback through chatting. We would also like you to be aware that there is a delay between our conferencing technology and YouTube. So please bear with us if it just takes a few minutes for us to respond. We promise we'll get to your questions and comments. So thank you so much. And like I said, Elizabeth will be joining us shortly. But I'd like to really spend some time handing over to Amelia and Darlena, who will tell us a little bit about themselves and the great topic that we're all interested in learning. Amelia and Darlena, would you mind introducing yourselves?
Sure, Darlena, if you want to go first, I'll come
sure.
after you.
I'm Darlena Jones. I'm the Director of Assessment and Research for AIR, the Association for Institutional Research, and I'm so happy, I'm so thankful that we've been invited. I'm interested in this.
And I want to echo Darlena's sentiments and say thank you, Stephen, for setting us up. And Elizabeth, I know she's going to join soon. I'm Amelia Parnell. I work for NASPA as the Vice President for Research and Policy. And Darlena and I, along with Christopher Brooks from EDUCAUSE, who's not joining us for the webinar today, but we've been together working on this project for, I think, formally at least a year. And
yeah, this is over a year.
Yeah, I think this is actually our fourth, maybe fifth time talking to a group about this. And so we've started to finish each other's sentences almost. And if you were to be logged in before this, you would have heard a really good conversation about the current state of predictive modeling and what's out there in the field. So really happy to be with you all. We have titled this Data Analytics and Student Success, Perspectives from IR, IT, and Student Affairs, because we wanted it to truly represent the partnership between our three organizations. And so happy to be in this audience of student affairs professionals. I hope that you'll find some of the results that we come up with from the study to be relevant not just to student affairs, but the relationships between student affairs and IR and IT. So Stephen, in terms of advancing the slides, you're comfortable doing that?
You bet.
Okay, so let's go on to the next one.
So a little bit about AIR before we get started. We are a professional organization of institutional research professionals that also includes folks who do assessment, like you all, people who do strategic planning, institutional effectiveness, business analytics, anything that's sort of data assessment-y, analytically, that's not a word, folks, we welcome them and embrace them as members of AIR. So we have 4,700 members across the world. Most of them are in the US, but we have large contingents in Canada, Taiwan, some other countries. Most of our members are from post-secondary institutions. We do have folks from industry and other professional associations like us, and about a third are assessment professionals. like I'm sure that most of you are involved in. We have a number of educational opportunities like the forum, like our free electronic newsletter e-air. We have a number of online courses, and then we provide research and dissertation grants. None of that all of that is available to anybody. That you don't have to be a member. So our motto or our policy is that we serve higher ed. We serve our members, but we more broadly serve higher ed. So we would welcome you to visit our website. Go ahead and move on to the next slide, please.
And I think considering our audience of student affairs professionals, it might be safe to say that most of you on the webinar know about NASPA and who we are. I'll highlight a few things that we are in currently our 100th anniversary celebration year, so we're really excited about that. And what brings us to the conversation is I think we've said for decades that student affairs divisions, conduct, housing, advising, recreation, clubs and activities, we have a lot of data at our disposal and we make a lot of data-informed decisions, but we're at a place now where the nexus of conversation about student success is starting to pair with more than just what we do for our function in our division, but also how that connects to other functional units across the campus. And so we are a thriving organization of about 16,000 individual members, a couple thousand organizational members. Much like what Darlena shared about AIR, we all, I think, have some level of commitment to helping students get in and through college. And so it presented a wonderful opportunity for us to connect on a data conversation. So I can tell you a lot more about NASPA, but most of it you probably already know. Let's go to the next slide about EDUCAUSE. And this is where if Christopher were on the call, he'd do it better. But in short form, EDUCAUSE is an organization like AIR and like NASPA that's a membership association primarily for those who work in information technology. So you'll see everybody from chief information officers, those who provide cabinet level direction for the function, but then also those who do more of the programmatic things, everything from warehousing and data integration, things of that sort. So they also have quite a few thousand members. They have lots of educational resources, really, really robust library of everything from articles and reports, including this one. You can find it there and at AIR and at our website as well. I like the thinking of uncommon thinking for the common good. Again, I think Christopher would describe it much better, but I think the role of IT even is starting to become transformed in that it's much more than a back office function, one that's primarily concerned with data integration and one that's much more forward facing and designed for the purpose of helping students succeed. So let's move on to the next one. And this is one of my favorite quotes. This is from an early round of interviews we did at NASPA, talking to vice presidents for student affairs about their current data condition. And I think that Darlene and I have put this in all of our presentations because it kind of sets the stage for what we were trying to discuss with you today, which is a quote from Mike Christakis at the University of Albany. And he says, basically, over the last 18 to 24 months, the use of data and analytics has evolved, and it led to the question of what are the data points that contribute to decisions? And so I think that whether we're talking about predictive modeling or descriptive analytics or just analytics for desk research, at some point you're looking to have data and the infrastructure by which it's delivered to help you make the most important decisions that you need to make in the most timely way. So that led us to our landscape analysis. So Stephen, let's get the next slide. As we described, it's a partnership between AIR, EDUCAUSE, and NASPA for the purpose of describing student success and the use of data to promote that. And so we knew that we couldn't really look at every single possible aspect of this, so we put it into kind of 4 big bucket areas. The first is, what are the types of data projects that campuses are actually conducting? What are the types of structures that need to be in place, everything from process to procedures to functional roles and things like that? How do those functions work together in a coordinated and collaborative way? And then basically after you've done all of that prep work, what types of interventions and programs and outcomes could you be looking at and saying that these are all informed by a data strategy that everybody's aware of? So what I'll go ahead and highlight now is that there are definitely other groups. There are other functional areas that could have been a part of the study. And this is by no means to suggest that the best data-informed work for student success only happens within IT, student affairs, and IR, but to keep the project manageable and completed on the timeline that's requisite with the funding we received from Lumina Foundation, we had to narrow it down. So at the end of the presentation, we'll have some additional considerations and recommendations, and that's where we'll share some ideas about who else we could have had involved and may have involved if we continue this work. So get the next slide. In terms of how we did it, we had a national survey. We started off with several interviews within our respective member bases. And I'll tell you that the strategy behind this shifted a little bit. We initially thought we would have a set of questions on the survey that were specific to IR, a set of questions that were specific to student affairs, and a set of questions specific to information technology. And the more we kept thinking about the questions we wanted to ask and who we wanted to ask it of, we realized it might work out better to just give all three groups the same set of questions. And so what you see here is a pretty good representation, a little bit skewed in that the shocker that data related questions, you have more of a response from IR professionals, but we got a pretty good number from student affairs and a trailing number from IT, but enough to be representative. So with almost 1,000 responses across all the major sectors and sizes of institutions, I'll tell you that the responses that you're going to see reflected in our charts, we feel like are ones we can hold on to. And they provide a really nice snapshot of the current landscape of data use across the country. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to start off with some good news and some news that's probably not shocking to you. When we ask campuses, tell us about the level of investment that your campus is making in data and analytics. So it doesn't matter if it's more predictive, we're using a more sophisticated model to predict a certain outcome, or whether it's on the descriptive side. So you're looking at means and medians and counts and things like that. Most all, so that's nearly 90%, if not slightly more, of all campuses, regardless of the size or the sector, said that they are making at least a minor or a major investment in data and analytics, which is a good thing. And that probably describes the unprecedented amount of articles and discussion around the need to make more data-informed decisions. And this is probably the why, because everybody's already investing in it. They want to know what kind of outcomes they can expect from the infrastructures they've made the investment for. Let's go to the next slide. So in this case, we're talking about the types of student success data projects. So basically, you've made all this investment in data, but what are you actually doing with it? So we asked a couple questions when we said, if you had to describe the types of projects that you have going on that happen every year versus those that may not happen every year, but every so often. So not every year, but periodically. And then the types of studies that you really don't do that much at all. So I also wouldn't say there's a shocker here, but the good news is that a lot of campuses are looking at post-graduation outcomes and the rates at which students get in and through college. So that's the good news. I say the not so good news is that when it comes to students' ability to afford higher education, that is an area that is ripe for additional inquiry. So while there were roughly 32% or so campuses that said they do look at it, the bigger and more shocking number is that almost 50% of students of campuses that say they do not look at all, not even annually or every so often, the rates at which students have the ability to pay for higher education. So early in this slide, I've already given you a bit of homework. So if you're watching and you want to know a place where you can dig into later that can make a big impact, I would suggest that you go back to your colleagues and say, what are we doing now to look at more closely students' ability to pay for college? It's a really underexplored area of inquiry. Let's go to the next slide. This slide represents the populations of students that we asked them. Like basically, you can't look at every single student population all at the same time. So if you had to prioritize and describe what your campus is investing in, what would be those populations that you're most concerned about? And so first-year students and transfer students seem to rise to the top. And if you look at the breakdown of percentages, there are still more than 60, 70% of students, students of color, students that are first generation, sophomore students. And so basically, those students in transition and first-year students are the leading two groups. There are still many other groups for which campuses say they're primarily investing their student success data work. So I believe Elizabeth told Darlene and I that we want to have some discussion. And rather than drone on for the whole hour or so that we have together, that we would have requisite pauses to get some feedback and questions from the audience. So Stephen, is this the part where we're supposed to check the YouTube and see if anybody is interested in something, or the chat window?
Yeah. So I think we can open this up to the general audience here, and we'd love to hear some of your feedback about what sort of studies your institution is doing in terms of supporting student success. Are there specific populations that you're looking into, like we just heard about? And also, which ones do you think that your institution should be looking into? For instance, I think that it would be reasonable to say that a lot of institutions are investing a lot of time into first-year retention. However, are we also seeing that there's significant drop-offs in the sophomore year? And what does that mean? So just curious to see generally in the field, what are you all up to? So if you don't mind typing that into the YouTube chat box, we can answer some of those questions and also learn a little bit more about what you're up to.
Stephen, is this that pause we're supposed to wait for?
That's right. And there's also a 7-second delay between when the question comes in and when we'll answer it. So I appreciate your patience on that, folks.
We got to figure out some way to fill the time. We got to.
We do. We need to have some sort of banter.
Yeah, I wish I had some. I love puns, but I wish I had a data pun or a joke I could tell.
It'll all add up soon. So what we have for question for you is, based on what you're seeing in the field about what people are prioritizing, do you feel like that is something in line with what you find to be helpful? Like the example I gave you earlier about when you did see a lot of institutions invest in your transfer populations in your first years, is that really where the data suggests that people should be focusing? Or is that just a continuation of some of our assumptions of importance?
Do you want to take that, Amelia, or do you want me to?
You can go first and I'll pick up the rear.
So I think, obviously, students in transition, first-year students, new transferring students, they're the highest risk population. And so it's also sort of the lower hanging fruit. We have a lot of data on those populations because of admissions, a lot of current data. Whereas students who are junior seniors, student athletes, we have a lot less data on those students. And usually by the time you can make it to your junior year, it's likely that you will graduate. So those students aren't as high risk as first-year students and new transferring students. So I think the focus is on the students who are at most risk. Now, if you don't have a retention, if you've solved your retention issue there at that point, then I think you would start looking at other at-risk populations.
And I would add to that, I think that for sure, you could do the studies on those students in transition, because in terms of the likelihood of them not persisting on time or persisting at all is greater at that point in their academic journey. But I also think that from a business standpoint, from a strategy standpoint, those are the populations that would be most likely to help you uncover any breakdowns in your system, in your process. And so if a student who's just gotten there has to make a tremendous number of decisions and navigate this highly complex environment, if they do so and to do it well, that means our structures are set up in a place where we can identify what they need and when they need it. If we find that large numbers of them are not completing, I think that's an indicator to us that we should be changing our business process. So I actually would think of the plus side, and that these are students that we focus on more frequently because they show us where the breakdowns might be and where we can improve in a much more timely way, I would say. So that's the positive. I'd hate to have a student watch this and feel like, oh man, they're targeting us because we're the ones that could be the most difficult to work with. I actually think they tell us the most about what we need to do better with our operations.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm also seeing some comments come in, interesting, coming from Loyola, talking about a religiously affiliated institution. Looking into religious affiliation, what that could mean on campus. So curious to see if you've come across any of that. And then we have a second question also about identifying the trajectory of African-American students graduating in different ways than other populations, and trying to figure out how we can learn a little bit more about different demographics in our student environment. So I think there's a religious-based question, a spiritual-based, and then also just a demographic breakout question generally.
Mm-hmm. Darlene, you want to go first? I like this model. You go first, and it's easier to come behind you than to start first. I promise I'll take the first one.
So I screw up, and then you make and then you're like, oh no, what you really meant to say was this.
No, all I say is +1, like everything Darlene is saying, plus a little more.
No. Actually, I don't know about retention rates at religiously affiliated versus more secular institutions. I don't know the difference, frankly. Hillary also continues to write that they are looking at job trajectory post-college graduate, as well as doing civic engagement, civic learning. I think that's commendable. I would love to see all institutions look a little bit more postgraduate. So I think that's really great. Jacqueline's question about African-American students graduating at higher rates and why they don't know why, and what resources could she go about looking at. So IPEDS, the U.S. Department of Education requires all higher ed institutions to submit a lot of data about their institution every year. So I would suggest you look at iPads data to see if there's any, compare your institution. By the way, all of that data is identified. So you know exactly who each institution is. I would try and do some benchmarking of your institution against other institutions, looking at African-American graduation rates specifically to see if you can find any institutional differences. I would also suggest you look at NCE, the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES's sample surveys, to look at the national data collected in financial aid, in post-graduation outcomes, things that might shed some light about why your institution is frankly doing an amazing job, and possibly how that could be transferred to other institutions. Amelia?
Yeah, so let me take the second question first. And I'm not looking at the chat window. I'm trying to make sure I don't screw anything up on my
cheating.
side. No, Darlene actually doing a better job than I am, because I probably would have better context. Is, if I understand the question correctly, is that they are seeing better outcomes and they want to know.
They are.
Okay, so that's notable. I never hear that framing of it. I would probably say it could be a timing issue. You know, I think that for the most part, data are a tool. And from the tool perspective, you have to figure out how you're going to use that tool to make some decisions about interventions and other types of programming. So I would actually say it's probably reflective of a couple things. Whatever tools you're using to collect your data seem to be giving you the best insight into what's happening with these students. And then your campus, you and your colleagues have made pretty good decisions about how to use that data to make a better, more informed set of decisions around programming. If you want to see how you're doing, in addition to College Navigator and all the other iPads based type data sets, you might want to check out College Results Online. Now, I'm not sure how often Education Trust has updated this, so the data might be a little outdated, but I think College Results Online gives you an opportunity to do some searching by institution type and seeing some basic outcomes. I'm not sure if they have demographic data in there that might describe race and ethnicity, but you might be able to compare your institution by others of the same sector and size. With regard to religiously affiliated institutions, I think interesting data that you could be collecting and using that may not be as traditional as, you know, the more quantitative stuff is probably your learning analytics data and any data that relates to learning outcomes about specific programming that you do that matches your religious affiliation mission. And I say that because I think with regard to post-graduation outcomes, a lot of employers are saying they want students who can communicate well, tell their story pretty efficiently, and connect a sense of purpose to why they want to have that particular job. I think religiously affiliated institutions do a really good job, this is my hunch, of further reinforcing the purpose and the mission of that type of education. I think the extent to which students can pull out specific types of learning and do so in ways that lead to data collections like reflection papers and things like that, it's a much more qualitative type of data, but I think it's just as rich as what you would get from a more quantitative side. So, Darlene, how does that sound?
Sounds a lot smarter than what I said.
Oh, no, we make a good team. We make a good team. I can't see the chat, so they're either throwing tomatoes at us or something. Shield me from it, Darlene.
I think you're funny. Okay, so probably Hillary, thank you so much for responding to Jacqueline. I think we could probably maybe move on.
Sure.
I think that'd be great. So, and go ahead and click on. We had these intermediate slides to remind us what we were going to be talking about. So another large section of the survey dealt with sort of the institutional structures in place that would accommodate or support or provide an environment conducive to doing student success analytics. So we looked at things like data infrastructure and stewardship, technical infrastructure, staffing, and the use of those metrics. So you could go to the next slide, please. So one of the main important things about a data analytics program is having good data, right? So we asked questions about data architecture, which is data architecture are the policies about how data are collected, stored, and integrated. Ways or the degree to which you believe the data are clean, are those data managed properly, and then is there an institutional data governance policy in place that helps govern the definitions of those data, who's collecting them, who has access to them, et cetera. So you can move to the next slide. So this is the result kind of globally of what we learned. So the bar chart that you're seeing, this was a perception scale. So we combined, it was a or a 4-point perception scale. So we combined the level of what is happening, no level to and little in red, they're developing processes, and then we have excellent processes in place. And what we found is that most institutions have either developing or excellent data management processes. Only 14% of institutions said that they didn't. On the other side of the fence, on the data governance side, we see it not quite as strong. So, but roughly 71%, 70% of institutions said that they either had developing or excellent, while 29%, almost a third of the institutions, felt that they didn't have any or very little data governance structures in place. So as you're looking to improve your institution, if your institution is weak in data governance or perhaps doesn't even have data governance, this might be a nice place that you could help promote data and data structures. Can you move to the next slide for me, please? So then we asked so data is obviously important, but having staff, trained staff in place to perform these analytics is equally important. So we asked similar set of questions. What percentage of your, we looked at the percentage of institutions who felt that they had strong staff structures, developing structures, or excellent structures. And what we found is that most institutions, 85%, said that they had the ability at their institution to conduct statistical analysis. Only 15% said that they didn't. On the bottom of that bar chart, we're looking at not so great news. So 58% of institutions said that they had adequate training for analytics on their analytics tool, but 42% said that they didn't. And that's going to be a theme that we're going to see kind of throughout the rest of this presentation, is that we don't have the resources really in place to do the types of studies that we believe are necessary. So can you move to the next slide for me, please? So one of the set of questions that we asked is, we collect data, we need to integrate those data, and then we need to use those data. So we need this process in place from collection through using it to really have a strong analytics program. So we had a laundry list of data sets that we ended up combining into 4 larger groupings. And what we found is that most institutions, 73%, are really good at integrating and or using their student information data. On the bottom of that chart, other student data is really that student behavioral data. So way fewer, only 21% of institutions are integrating and or using that data in a way that would make it useful to an analytics program. So again, as you move forward in your work, supporting or championing student affairs data, student behavioral data, and these analytics programs is going to be very important. Can you move forward for me, please? So we asked our respondents to tell us what components of a data-informed strategy exist at their institution. And most, 85%, said that they had developed performance metrics and then had a clear connection to their institutional mission. So sort of that high level aspects of a data-informed strategy. But as you can see at the bottom of that chart, only 62% said that they had training. Again, this is that theme that we saw kind of throughout, is that we have these very high level goals and aspirations, but when it gets down to the kind of the boots on the ground, we don't have the staff or training or resources at the level that we probably need them to be in order to be very successful at this. Can you move to the next slide for me, please? So we also asked respondents to give us their perceptions about how those data are being used or protected at their institution. Good news is that 94% of respondents said that they believed that the student data was private, so that they were able to respect and keep those data private while at the same time using those data in analytics projects. But 46% felt strongly that those data were not being used properly. They were not being understood properly, they weren't being used properly, or the wrong conclusions were being drawn from those data. So yay for the data, the student privacy. We got to do a better job at using those data for decision making. So that takes us to our next set of questions. So Elizabeth?
Yes, I'm here. Sorry to join your call late.
No, you're fine.
Hello.
So yeah, go ahead.
So the questions are, what structures are in place at your institution, which need to be improved to better support an analytics program? And then what are your concerns regarding data and privacy in student success projects? And while we're waiting for the chat to go through, I wanted to go ahead and comment on your last slide. I think that's something that I've seen at my institution of trying to get the right data to the right people, where it still protects the students' privacy, but that people can use it who need it and do so with the training that they need to understand it correctly. And it's just, there's so many factors to take into account with the data. So
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we have to applaud that we're collecting it, integrating it, and using it, some of the data, but there are probably other data that would give more insight into student success beyond grades, beyond admissions, enrollments.
For sure. I mean, I think Darlene and I and Christopher have talked about it being almost on a continuum. So at the least, the easiest to collect data would be your course data and how they're doing at the midterm, standpoint and things like that. Other things that could be equally as predictive or influential, I should say, would be their use of support services. So do they go to advising appointments on time? Do they participate in tutoring? Have they completed their NESI and exhibited signs of homesickness and things of that sort? Campuses that are really more advanced will do things like Wi-Fi tracking of the location on the campus and things like that. The logins of the learning management system. So I agree with Darlena that there's a lot more that you could probably leverage, especially data that's housed in student affairs and other functions, for sure.
This is Steve. I'm particularly passionate about maintaining student privacy and investing some time learning more about data governance. Have either of you seen an institution that has a distributed data governance model, where there's an institutional one, but then there's one localized to student affairs? And what's the relationship between those type of models?
Well, Darlene, I did say I was going to take the first one first, right?
I have not seen that. We're lucky if we see the institutional model, frankly. I've not seen institutions with a student success model.
Yeah, I would also agree with Darlena. I think if Christopher were on the call, he might be able to describe data governance from just an infrastructure standpoint and give you a couple examples. So now I'll add to that and say, while I have not seen it called data governance per se, I've seen lots of local or unit or division-based efforts that might imply that there's some type of data governance at play. I've seen mostly in the area of communication. So if you have a lot of data on the outcome of particular programs and things like that, how would the division relay that to the larger public? So University at Albany, for example, takes really small index cards, and they're maybe like square shaped, and they put small data points on them and stick them around the campus and say, hey, did you know that, I'm making this up, 65% of students who go see a career advisor within the first 2 years have better outcomes, things like that. So it feels as though in order to get to that end, they probably have made some decisions about who gets to report on the data, who has access to it, and things like that. So that's more inferential, but I would agree with Darlena that I've not seen anybody say this is our data regime, as Christopher would call it, or a formal data governance structure in place. I'm sure they do, though. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt.
We seem to have a quiet audience.
We do. Pre-turkey comatose.
Yeah.
We want to move forward?
Yeah, we can keep going. We've overwhelmed them. We give them a lot of things.
That's right.
Quiet reflection. So I think I'm on deck. So we've talked about what's needed. We've talked about the students' focus. We've talked about governance, and I think now is the time to figure out how do we put all that together. So we had a set of questions in the instrument that talked about roles and responsibilities, how to create a unique data strategy for your campus, and how to assess the impact of that. And once you have all that figured out, who does what? And so Darlena hit on a lot of good notes that relate to training or the lack thereof or opportunity for more training. But for the training that has happened and for the staff roles that are in place, how do we actually put all that together and make it work? And so let's go to the next slide. When we ask campuses to tell us about, are we on the next slide? I don't want to get too far ahead. Okay. Yeah. When we talk to campuses and ask them with regard to role level, so senior level folks, mid-level folks, and then those who are kind of what we refer to as frontline staff, how are those particular groups making decisions and how are they interacting with students? And so we found that a lot more of the mid-level and front-level staff are actually using their data opportunities to influence individual students. So that might be the case of an academic advisor or career advisor who's looking at a particular platform and telling a student, I don't see you doing enough of this or you're doing a whole lot of that. Here are the decisions you should probably make next. And so that seems in line with what you'd see in terms of mid-level and front-level staff. As in regard to senior level staff and mid-level staff making decisions, theirs is probably much less connected to the individual student, but they're making large-scale decisions on behalf of multiple students at a time. And so that doesn't seem to be shocking either. Most often, I don't think you'll see too many VPs of student affairs having daily meetings with individual students, though they probably would like to. Their role is much more strategic, and they're probably figuring out the allocation of resources and using data that way instead. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the part that got interesting for us, and Darlene, I have to credit her with making this look very, very nice. But when you think about particular primary roles, and this is where we kind of had the revelation in our conversations about the questions for the survey. If you were to ask the average higher ed pundit, what do you think the roles of academic affairs, student affairs, IT, and IR might be? You'd probably expect them to say that the primary roles for IT are to develop the back-end infrastructure, the databases, and things like that make it work. That IR would be the ones creating the individual and collective models for how we assess our data and analyze results. And then you have your programmatic side of things, the intervention side, which is student affairs and academic affairs and others that are executing on interventions. And so this first slide says that those traditional roles do exist. And so the triangles that you see at 40% or more of institutions, you do see those roles clearly identified as what I just described. But we got some additional news. Let's go to the next slide. Are we on? Okay. Here's
go back, please.
Go back one more. Yeah, they look almost alike. This one is so the good news in here is that while we have those primary roles and those traditional roles that I described, there's actually a little bit more of a cross section. So what you would expect to see is that a lot of IR professionals solely devoted to doing the assessment of the model and how is the model performing, is it highly predictive enough. But we heard about some campuses, and they told us in the survey results that some IR professionals do work with student affairs to actually assess the outcomes of certain interventions. On the flip side, we do see a lot of student affairs professionals who said actually they are involved in the early development of those types of predictive models. And IT has a little bit of a role in both of those, specifically in the area of early alerts. And so I think that what we have here is a little bit of evidence to suggest that the once siloed or described as siloed functions of IR, IT, and student affairs are actually maybe not so siloed. And maybe that the buckets that they're sitting in are not hard lines, but instead dotted lines in which IR, IT, and student affairs professionals actually work together in a more comprehensive and coordinated way. So now let's go to the next slide. All right, so we've talked a little bit about who should do what and what the roles are and how they're evolving. And here's the other news, that more staffing is needed. And this makes sense. I think that across the country, there's largely a staffing challenge with regard to data and analytics anyway. I think if you were to go to the AIR website, you'll see that on any given day, there's probably at least 100 open positions for somebody that ranges all the way up to a director of IR, all the way down to project analysts or data analysts. And so basically, this is represented here in this chart, and that staffing that's required for data analytics studies for student success are largely understaffed. And so whether it's a campus saying that they already have something in place and they need more, or that nothing is in place and they need more, over half, almost close to 70% of institutions say that they need more staff in the areas of data analytics and even the reporting function. So let's pause here. I think we got a couple more questions. Elizabeth, hopefully we have at least one in the audience that might want to talk to us, but any thoughts while we wait for questions to come in?
Yes, so the questions are, how do you see yourself supporting other units' efforts, and how do other units' efforts support your work? And even before you got there, Amelia, Jacqueline talked about she works in residence life and has trouble getting data from their IR department. but it's because of a staffing issue. So
Yes, definitely.
that's a huge piece of that.
Yeah, that is. I want to take a little bit of a spin on this. And maybe Darlene, you could take the first question. I'll take the second one. The question of how to get more of what you need, I think specific to student affairs. Darlene and I did a joint presentation at the Assessment and Persistence Conference at NASPA. And then shortly after that, we had a town hall where pretty much anybody who had a role in student affairs that was related to data came. And they pretty much got to tell us everything from what their challenges are in terms of multiple demands for information, to coordinating of those requests, to figuring out what the latest, greatest reports and research might be. And the number one thing they all said was a challenge was that you have all these functional units and all these consumers of data, and the need to coordinate it and figure out how you can actually triage some of the things. And I think what it came down to is, hey, I'm just one person. I don't have enough time and bandwidth to supply everything that we need, but we know that there are decisions that have to be made. And so a couple things that they suggested was that there be a calendar. And I know that seems like very elementary. And I think in IR world, Darlene, it probably is routine for an IR director to have this, but some schedule of routine data collections and when they're going to happen. So that if you have to tell a colleague, I can't get to it right now, but let me show you what's in queue, it could both signal to the colleague what's already going on that they might find useful, but it also gives them a dedicated time to say, here's what I can actually work with. So it doesn't really get to the training and capacity issue, but it does get to a bit of a coordinating effort so it doesn't feel like you're telling everybody no all the time. So again, I can't see the chat window to know if that's the person's lived experience, but you're in good company. I'll say that much. Darlene, you want to take the one about supporting your work or how others support your work? Was that a question for us?
Actually, that was a question for them.
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
That was part of our, but Jacqueline said that IR is understaffed. Unfortunately, we see that sort of nationwide. We, shameful plug, we are doing the national survey of IR offices right now that will hopefully provide data to individual institutions so that they will have evidence that other institutions maybe are sourced better. So I would suggest, Jacqueline, if you could talk to your IR director and see if they could, maybe that data might help them in securing lines if those lines don't exist yet.
And we also had a question from Dean. He asked, when you have an institution which has not had a culture of assessment, how do you move to getting them to do effective assessment and analyzation and sharing the data so it is actionable?
Amelia, do you want that one or do you want me to?
I'll do a short answer and then you can pick up after that. Okay. Culture doesn't happen overnight, and I think it takes a steady stream of a coalition of the willing to get it started. Data can be political. And so I think if there's not currently a culture at all, I hope that means that there's not a negative culture of data, because sometimes you can get to the position of someone saying, I just needed evidence that my program was working better than someone else's, so I need more resources. If that's not the case and you truly just have not started yet, I think you get the slow roll of a culture going by showing that you can do more than just use your gut. And so basically, if you have a feeling that something that you're doing is working well, I'd say focus on the positive before you start getting into negative connotations with data. If you have a hunch that something that you're doing well is working, maybe get a colleague or two to join you and say, are you by chance doing something in a program nature or something like that that you feel like is working well? Let's see what evidence we can collect together as a group. And so I think that maybe building a culture shows that from the very early onset of this, it should be something collaborative and that you have something that's easily explained and communicate to somebody else. Few numbers. Don't overwhelm your colleagues with pages and pages of reports. But I think you'll find that it makes for a more robust conversation. So the culture of communication is the one that I would emphasize most. And if you can get that going by highlighting the positive with data, you might find that you have some colleagues who want to do the same. So that's my personal advice to how I think you could start to build that culture. Darlene?
So every institution has to go through accreditation and or program accreditation if you have those types of programs, nursing programs, engineering programs at your institution. So there is assessment happening that may be, shut off into the IR office or assessment office somewhere under lock and key. But one of, as I think it was Jacqueline who said that her IR office is understaffed, and most are, but if you all could reach out with a helping hand, and if you have that type of experience at your in your program, that you could help your IR office analyze those data, share those data, I think you're going to find very passionate people in the IR office that are crazily overworked, but would be willing to work with you if at all possible to help share those data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we had another question from Kelsey saying that they're surprised to see the role of IT being rated so low in your previous charts, and wondered if that was in part because of the low response rate from IT people, that made up a much smaller percentage of your respondents for the survey.
I want to say that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I want to say that that probably is part of it. I think there were a couple questions we had a pretty low end there, and I want to give IT more credit and say that the conversations I've had do involve most of the evolving relationship between IR and IT. And I almost want to ask Darlene to pick up on this. Not in every campus is the IR IT division like that. There could be functions where both IR and IT live in the same unit. So
yes.
The results we see for IR could largely, by default, be reflective in part of IT as well. So, Darlene, would you add?
So this set of questions, we did ask each respondent which unit is responsible. So obviously, IR is not 100% knowledgeable about what other units are doing. Not Student Affairs is 100% knowledgeable about what IR and IT are doing. I do think that the IT not being as represented is a result of the low end and possibly a misunderstanding on the side of IR and Student Affairs about exactly what IT does. So I agree, but I do think that there are probably some caveats there that IT is a little bit more tasked with the hardware side of things, that those items aren't in this survey. We assumed a certain level of hardware networking work that maybe IT is more responsible for that isn't reflected here.
Mm-hmm. But a very critical part too.
Right, exactly.
Thank you for that answer. And I think, well, especially recognizing our time, let's move on to the next section.
Sure. So the why are we doing this is really what this last section is going to be about. So can you please, so why are we doing analytics projects? What are the outcomes of those analytics projects? What are the costs? What types of interventions are happening? So that's what we're going to look at next. Can you please move to the next slide? So a lot of predictive analytics work is used to help identify students who are possibly facing poor grades or lack of motivation to continue. And that data gets pushed into an early alert system. So we did ask a number of questions about early alerts and found that 72% of institutions have some form of an early alert system, so basically 3/4. Of those, roughly 3/4 have a see something, say something form on their website, or a phone call or a phone number listed on the website. If you would like to report something, here is an anonymous form. 68%, about 2/3 of the institutions, said that they actually have a predictive model in place that feeds data into an early alert. So reasons why they don't have an early alert, for those that said that they didn't, resources, pretty much. 65% said they didn't have the resources to purchase or have the types of support for an early alert. And sadly, 18% said that their leaders weren't interested in having that type of system on at their institution. You go to the next slide for me, please. So access to early alert data for those institutions that have early alert. Most institutions, 84%, gave access to those data to their academic advisors. Faculty advisors, a little bit less. About half of the institutions gave access to counseling. And to the right, Res Life staff is at about 1/3 of the institutions. Can you go to the next slide? So how are those data being used in interventions? So not surprising, most institutions, because they give data to the academic advisors, 96% of institutions said that that data is used in academic advising. 95% say that that data is used to refer that student to a student support system like tutoring, advising, counseling. You move to the next. Oh, actually, stay here. I'm sorry. Can you go back? I wanted to point out the bottom of this. Roughly a third, 37%, said that those data are used for nudge campaigns. And I think we're going to start seeing nudge campaigns grow as we become a little bit more critical about the results of predictive models. I think we're going to be a little less intentional about calling out individual students and more using that data to suggest that students go visit their counselors, suggest students do this, but without nudging, being so overt. Can you move to the next slide for me, please? So we looked at kind of across the board from a descriptive predictive study, a descriptive analytic study to a predictive analytic studies to an early alert system. How are those interventions being used? So in the descriptive studies, 64% were used to inform program development. About half were used to inform academic advising. Predictive studies, 39% were used to inform nudge campaigns and 35% to inform advising. And early alert, 55% were used to conduct intrusive advising, which is going to the individual student and suggesting that they do something. They go to advising, they go to counseling, versus these more quiet nudge campaigns. And then 54% were to make referrals. Can you go to the next slide for me, please? So as you're creating interventions, you do need to think about data privacy. You do need to think about how some data are inherently biased and how those data should be communicated. So in predictive modeling, we don't know that Darlena specifically is at risk or is in need of an intervention. We just know that someone who looks like Darlena last year, whether she's a math major, who's a first-generation college student, who's the first time away from home, someone who looks like her didn't succeed in a way that we would have hoped that she had. So we have to be very careful that we use the results of predictive modeling in ways that are supportive of the student, but not negative or imply that we know that student is going to fail. Can you go to the next slide for me, please? So one of the a set of questions, we wanted to know the why. Why is your institution involved in modeling or involved in analytics? 96% said that they wanted to improve student outcomes, which I think is an amazing result. I assume the other 4% are institutions that don't have retention problems because they're highly selective. I don't know that for sure, but that's my assumption. 71% said that they wanted to be more efficient at the delivery of their services, so that they wanted to, and then 39% said that they wanted to use that information to eliminate or reduce programs that don't seem to significantly contribute to student success. You move to the next slide for me, please. So I'm an assessment outcomes sort of professional, and one of the things that I wanted to see was the data on whether institutions were measuring the ROI, what is the return on investment for the institution for these programs. Sadly, we found that about half of the institutions don't measure the costs of these programs. So they really can't answer whether or not these programs are valuable. On the outcome side, about a fourth of the institutions don't measure outcomes. So they don't know the direct linkage between their work in analytics and whether or not they were able to influence student success or student retention. So as you move out and start talking about these programs at your institution, think about costs versus outcomes and have that sort of hard conversation with your IR office. Can you move to the next slide, please? It's the reason you want to talk to your IR folks is that IR is typically responsible to measure costs and outcomes for the descriptive side, and outcomes for the predictive analytics side. Student affairs, on the other hand, has been tasked, at least for the majority of our institutions, tasked with looking at costs and outcomes of their early alert systems, because they tend to be the ones managing those systems. And if they don't measure, we asked, why don't you measure costs and outcomes? And most of them said they don't have capacity, they don't have the data infrastructure, and they don't know actually how to study an ROI. Can we move to the next slide? And Elizabeth, I guess I would recommend, we only have 5 minutes if we continue and then do, okay. Amelia?
I was going to make the same suggestion. Let's skip on to the slide that has the recommendations. I think I can take us through these pretty quickly. Some of these recommendations, I think, have already emerged in a lot of the points that Darlene and I have made. The first, and it kind of relates to the last question about IT, and do we have institutionally appropriate roles set in place for IR, IT, and student affairs, and others? And so we would recommend that if you do, there's a good chance that you could re-examine those and figure out how they could be more intentionally connected, which leads to number 2. I think to make this work really the most effective and leverage the resources in the best way, we should try to remove the silos. And if we can't remove them, we should at least adjust them so that it feels as though IR, IT, and student affairs and others are not siloed to the point of only being able to perform certain functions. And I think that after we do that, that could lead to number 3, which is us being able to better prioritize the measurement of certain student outcomes. And then the last one is that with all the discussion of student success data, there's another type of data that we didn't really explore to a great degree, which is the qualitative side of things, and specifically qualitative data in the form of things we'd ask students and they could tell us specifically about. So it's a whole other conversation Darlene and I can have about students' perception of their own data privacy and what should be accessible to others and how they feel, how safe or secure their data they feel like they might be. So these are all areas that if we were to continue the work, we'd like to go into these areas. But some additional next steps, let's go to the next slide, the last slide, which is what we kind of highlighted in the beginning. That there's more need for us to examine the role of academic affairs. We know that all of the discussions we've had so far have not largely focused as much on the impact and the very, very influential role of faculty and those who interface with students in the classroom on a weekly basis. And then the last is that we couldn't ignore the fact that there was tremendous opportunity for additional work related to coaching and training, both in the aspect of how to use your results, but then also how to set up the strategy around it. So training at all levels, not just for those who are primarily front-facing or mid-level staff. So if you like what we've shared with you and you want to see more, we gave you the first blush of everything that's in that report. So the screenshot there, you can find it at the website there, or just go to Google and put in institutions' use of data and analytics for student success. So I hope we didn't come to a crash landing, but I think the last slide is just questions and discussion. Or Elizabeth, if you and Stephen have parting remarks about how to see the webinar or anything else you want to share, I think Darlene and I think we're done with our formal part. Are we, Darlene?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we had a couple more comments come in. A very strong agreement with the piece around not telling students that they're destined to fail. A self-fulfilling prophecy. And then also with the prioritizing the number 3 of the recommendations, prioritizing measuring student learning outcomes. Sharon said to take it a step further and focus on the use of measurements. Reevaluate if the use has had the intended impact. So really wanting to see what we're measuring, and if we're measuring kind of the thing that we're measuring, I think is, Sharon, feel free to chime in more too, but I think is kind of that idea of just continuing to think about that. I wanted to add a comment too. I think with the piece around predictive analytics, one of the things we found is, and this relates to the structures as well, that our predictive analytics models are only as good as the data that goes into them. And when we don't have complete data, that impacts how good that is, or how accurate the predictions are, as well as how meaningful they are. So for example, we know from NESI that our students work more than students at other universities, but we don't have like a centralized place to know which students of our entire student body are the ones who are working. And so figuring out, for us, we've had a lot of conversations around what's missing and how does that impact the analytics and what can we add in. So I need to add that.
So we did learn on student working, we did learn that students who work on campus don't have the sort of less engagement as students who work off campus. And that's probably obvious, is that they're on campus.
Right.
But I would, if there was a way to sort of, to be able to capture that, I think that would make a really interesting study.
Mm-hmm. We're doing some work related to work on campus.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, but I'll tell you about it offline, Darlena.
I'd love to hear it.
So, Stephen, Elizabeth, I think this is the part where we're supposed to say thank you for having us, and thanks to the participants.
Thank you for your presentation. And Steve will be sending out the link to the YouTube webinar that you can watch it, that anyone can watch again. We'll plan to send out the PowerPoint, but you can also look at that report. And stay tuned for our next structured conversation in January.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.